የሐሳብ ገበታ ሐሳብ ያለ ልዩነት ሚዛናዊነት እንዲሁም በአሳታፊነት የሚንሸራሸርበት ቤት። በሐሳብ ገበታችን ወቅታዊ፣ ማህበራዊ፣ ፖለቲካዊ እንዲሁም የህግ ጉዳዮች በስፋት በጥልቀትና በአካታችነት ይቀርባሉ። የሳምንቱ እንግዳም የሳምንቱ በተጋባዥ የማህበረሰብ አንቂዎች፣ ፖለቲከኞች እንዲሁም ሙያተኞች የሚቀርቡበት ፕሮግራም። ወቅታዊ ጉዳይ፣ ወቅታዊ ሀገራዊ ጉዳዮች የሚዳሰሱበት ዝግጅት፣ የውይይትና የክርክር መድረክ። በተለያየ ጎራ የሚገኙ ታላላቅ ፖለቲከኞች፣ የማህበረሰብ አንቂዎች እንዲሁም ሙያተኞች በሐሳብ ዙሪያ ፊት ለፊት የሚወያዩበት ከዛም አልፎ የሚሟገቱበት ፕሮግራም። ህዝባዊ መድረክ በተለያዩ ጉዳዮች ላይ ሁሉም የሐሳብ ገበታ ቤተሰቦች በቀጥታ ሐሳባቸውን የሚያቀርቡበትና ተሳታፊ የሚሆኑበት ቤተሰቦቻችን እድል የምንሰጥበት ጊዜም። እነዚህና ሌሎች ሳምንታዊ ፕሮግራሞችን ለእናንተ እናቀርባለን። ይህንን የተወደደ ቻናል ሰብስክራይብ በማድረግ ቤተሰብ ይሁኑ። በስፋት ተደራሽ እንዲሁም ለሌሎች ያጋሩም። የሐሳብ ገበታው እንዲጠናከር በተሻለ ጥራትና ስፋት ወደ እናንተ እንዲደርስ በሐሳቦ በሙያውና በገንዘቡ ይደግፉን። የሐሳብ ገበታን በሱፐር ቻት፣ በሱፐር ታንክስና በሱፐር ስቲከር አጋርነቱን ያሳዩን። በጎፈንድሚ አማራጭ የሐሳብ ገበታን ያበረታቱ። ስለ ሐሳብ አስተያየቶ እንዲሁም ድጋፎም እናመሰግናለን። ዓላማችን የሐሳብ ማህበረሰብ መፍጠር ነው። የሐሳብ ገበታም
Good morning, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today we have a guest for the Ethiopia Today Podcast. He is a well-known scholar of Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the Greater Horn of Africa in general for more than 2 decades. His name is Kjelit Tronvoll, Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at Oslo New University College. That is his current status, but before that he has been working in so many different positions and institutions. Without further ado, I'm very grateful, Professor Tronvoll, for accepting my invitation. It has been a long gestation, and I was trying to find the best time to have you, but it's great to have you before a Christmas break. Thank you very much for being my guest today.
Thank you, Maurice. Thank you for inviting me.
All right. So you are, as a professor of peace and conflict studies, and as an ardent student, I would say, ardent student of Ethiopian politics, ranging from Ethiopian political culture, democratization, peace building, to some extent even the issue of nationalism, the nation building and state formation, generally the state-people relationship. And these are all of the issues we have been addressing over the last 2 decades. So I couldn't find any better candidates than yourself to discuss these issues. So it is my honor to have you. With that, without further ado, let me get into the first question to set the ground for us. Tell us or walk us through your involvement with Ethiopian politics. When was your first time that you were interested in the Ethiopian politics? Or maybe your major work on the Ethiopian politics in the Horn of Africa. Let's start with that.
Yeah, actually, you have to go further back than 2 decades. It's 3.5 decades. In the late 1980s, I started to prepare my dissertation fieldwork as a social anthropology student at the University of Oslo. And I selected the Ethiopian conflict context to study. And more particularly the Eritrean War of Liberation from Ethiopia. I was a keen student and had a great interest in theories of nationalism and the recruitment of a peasant army. I was kind of contemplating both the Tigrayan resistance, but I soon kind of identified the Eritrean War of Liberation as a unique opportunity for any researcher to follow possibly the birth of a new nation. And I tried to enter the field because I wanted to study it from the side of the Eritrean perspective, from the Eritrean resistance, not from the Ethiopia-centric perspective. I was on my way into the liberated areas in 1990. I had an approval by EPLF at that time to do research in their controlled areas. But I was held back by EPLF awaiting what they saw was then the takeover of Asmara, which then happened in May 1991. And just a few weeks after the takeover of Asmara, I managed to enter through Ethiopia and into liberated Eritrea as the first international researcher ever, and just a handful of other foreigners were invited in, mostly then development experts or development coordinators. I settled in a small village in the highland of Eritrea for a couple of years, actually, and stayed in Eritrea until after the referendum on independence, 1993. But obviously, studying Eritrea means studying Ethiopia. And since then, I've been very keenly addressing Ethiopian politics. And just after 1993, I shifted my focus. Well, I still continued to work on Eritrea, but more particularly in Tigray. As I visited Tigray already in 1991, just at the end of 1991, crossing the border from Eritrea, so to say, into Tigray. And since then, I've been kind of bogged down in Ethiopian politics and Ethiopian research. It was not my intention to keep focusing on Ethiopia per se. My research interests have centered, as you said, around conflicts, authoritarianism, political dynamics, human rights abuse, and to view from a grassroots perspective how power, how state power, how political power influence everyday lives of African citizens, and how they are navigating this very much contested terrain.
So basically you are saying to go beyond the foreground institutions and go into the background and see the dynamics of the everyday politics.
This is what anthropology do. The political science guys and girls, they view it from the state institutions mostly, although with a great caveat, there are some very grounded empirical based political scientists too. But anthropologists, we like to study the human interactions and how individuals and the local communities, for instance, are perceiving macro level politics, and how they are kind of adjusting to it or resisting it. And Ethiopia continued, sadly, regrettably, Ethiopia continued and continues to produce conflicts and produced authoritarianism and produced suppressions and produced human rights violations, all these topics which I find interesting to study and try to understand. So hence, 35 years after I started to study Ethiopia, I'm still there. And I guess I will be there until I retire and go to my grave, in a sense of that focus.
But yeah, that is a, if we see it from the bright side of the things, but then at the same time, this also shows the underlying issue. We are still talking about the same issue of democratization. And I can see that in 1995, you were discussing about the process of democratization. And now we are almost just a year away from the third decade, right? 1995 to 2025. And still, Ethiopia is not democratic. Actually, we are talking about the survival, ontological security now for all Ethiopians. And so this is very perplexing, whether we approach it from the political science perspective, from the constitutional lawyer's perspective, or from anthropological point of view. The question remains, which means, why are we still mired in authoritarian tendencies and the cycle of violence? That's why I chose the topic of cycle of violence, and if there is a prospect for peace in Ethiopia. So that said, let me ask you one follow-up question, since you touched up on the Eritrean issue since the 1998 and early 1990s. Some people, actually well-known scholars, tend to say that the Eritrean version of nationalism is very unique in the Horn of Africa. Do you see that it is, and it's so unique? If unique, in what way?
The Eritrean nationalism?
Yeah, they say that the Eritrean nationalism is very unique.
No, it isn't. It is very much comparable to many other nationalisms which have been produced by of being grounded on a colonial state and have been effectuated and produced by a Marxist-Leninist liberation movement. You have it in southern African states. You have it on other continents. It's very much the same kind of ideological wrapping and the same grounding. What made the Eritrean War of Independence rather unique was its longitude in warring, 30 years of a liberation war. It can be said to have some unique elements in the sense that its connection to the old Ethiopian Empire prior to Italian colonization of the territory of Eritrea, and how a bulk of the people of Eritrea, particularly the Kebesa, the Highlanders, the Tigrinya speakers, were associated with the Ethiopian political realm and continue to be part of Ethiopian political dynamics. In that sense, Eritrea is a peculiar state. It had a very, very fervent nationalism produced by the war itself and by the ideology of EPLF. But you also see that after its independence, de facto in 91 and de jure in 93, Eritrea has never, or the Eritrean government, or rather President Isaias Afwerki, has never considered Eritrea as a truly, genuinely independent country from Ethiopia. And neither has Ethiopian authorities and Ethiopian government. And we see that very clearly in terms of its bilateral relations, which have never been properly institutionalized and formalized. The bilateral relations between Ethiopia and Eritrea after 1993 has been very much informal communications between the head of governments, outside the two channels of the foreign ministries even. So, even though they are separate, even though they are very distinct Eritrean nationalism, it's still very much interwoven with the Ethiopian political fabric.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. Actually, the issue you just pointed out would be relevant for the next issue we'll address about the 2018 so-called peace agreement, because for many people, you might come across that discussion that the peace agreement was never been formal, as you know, it has never gone through the formal procedure, exactly like you said. But even the Ethio-Eritrea relationship back then was not formal at all. So we can see the pattern. So, but before that, one of the readings I have about the Eritrean nationalism, the unique features, is pertains to the artificial creation of colonialism, the issue of coloniality, saying that it wouldn't be, factually speaking, that Eritrea was colonized by the Ethiopian Empire itself as being part of the empire, as you said. So much of the discussion was the artificial creation of states through narratives, popular narratives. That is one of the readings I have. I don't know if you buy into that or not. So let's go forward. And speaking of peace, management of diversity, and bringing, the decision-making process as close to people as possible, that is the purpose of democratization. We are still far away. There is no trust between the people and the government, the governed and the governing. The polity is still in a troubled water, to say the least. And now, in retrospect, of course, now we have the 5 years time utility. What was your expectation of the 2018 change of regime or transition or whatever the name is? And what went wrong since then? Did you have realistic expectations, some reasonable suspicion, or were you part of that euphoria? The wind of change is going to blow Ethiopia after 2018.
Well, I have to say that of course, I was at first happy with the new rhetoric of Abiy Ahmed when he took power. I don't call it a change of regime, and I was very skeptical of stating that already in April 2018, because it was the same party. The new chair of the party has been brought up within EPRDF from very young age. All the new people at Arad Kilo or in the palace were EPRDF party members, but it was a new rhetoric. But I also was skeptical exactly because the new leadership and the prime minister himself had been a cadre all his life, more or less. How could he bring about the changes he stated he wanted to bring about? I was critical for that reason, and I was critical also because of his religious rhetoric very early as we heard it. I remember discussing with Ethiopian colleagues who were more embracive and positive to him, and tried to caution them not to be too over optimistic. Not because of the personality of the new prime minister himself, but because of the entrenched structural and historical and political and cultural obstacles which we do find in Ethiopia, which are an impediment to democratic transition. And that's what we see today. It is not a one-man show. It is not a small elite who can change that entrenched political context overnight. It will take generations. And so I was very quickly a pessimist already during the summer, May, June, when we saw his mopping up operations against the Tigrayan communities and Tigrayan political elite, and the new rhetoric he introduced during the summer of 2018, that, well, this is it. And as you know, already in the fall of 2018, they started to rearrest journalists and crack down upon dissidents and on, for instance, the Sidama referendum process and so on and so forth. So it was clear that it was a temporary window of a couple of months in the spring of 2018 where you have an aventura, an opening, where everyone were allowed to speak their voice and to criticize power. But very rapidly, that opening was closed down again when the new power elites saw that an open discourse, a plurality of opinions, would not necessarily strengthen or consolidate their power base, rather the opposite.
Yeah, that's an excellent perspective, Professor, because most of the people, I don't know why, I don't still have the answer for that question, tend to lose sight of the structural issues as well as the political culture. Okay, the deeply embedded, as you said, political culture, and just focusing only on the agency, assuming even the agent himself is genuine. Okay, being part of the existing old system or the ancient regime, and again forgetting everything which is true to its name for the Ethiopian people. One of our political culture saying that, because I remember I was part of it, I was part of the Kero movement, I know it, I was at Haramaia University back then, being the head of the Department of College of Law. So I have a graphic memory of everything. And the people were saying that anything has got to be better than the existing system. This kind of political culture, like, has got to be better than the TPLF-dominated system. So the focus was mainly on the TPLF, and then the witch hunting process started in terms of accountability and justice, which is dear to my heart. So I have that observation, but still I don't know why not quite a lot of people, even scholars and fairly minded, reasonable people, were not seeing that things are not going as we wish to be. Well, that could be one of your observations, maybe. Maybe that could be a pattern in the Ethiopian political culture. So as a prelude to the Tigra War, or the war in the northern part of Ethiopia, as it is said today, do you see a major turning point when the train went off the rail? And not back in 2018, that is one of the turning points you already alluded to. Maybe how do you see the Ethio-Eritrean peace agreement? Was it a peace agreement or a war pact, as some people tend to say? Or what led to the Tigray War, basically, for you, in your view?
Well, it is a complex backdrop to that. And I've written and published recently a couple of articles explaining the fall and the collapse of EPRDF, for instance, how the disagreements within the EPRDF coalition started to emerge already after the death of Meles Zenawi in 2012, 2013, 2014, with the start of the Muslim protest movement and then the Preor movement, how that was reflected within the EPRDF coalition, particularly the differences and the policies articulated by the Amhara component party against the TPLF dominance and control, and also, of course, the Oromo party. I interacted very closely with some of the leading figures in the EPRDF at that time, and it was particularly the political sentiments emanating from the Amhara bloc which made TPLF officials nervous, not so much from the Oromo at that time, 2015, 2016. I think for the war itself, the outbreak on the war on Tigray is linked to the dynamic, obviously, within the EPRDF, the waning power of TPLF, which then produced Abiy Ahmed as the next chair and prime minister. At that time, 2017, 2018, I had a project together with colleagues in Tigray on the Eritrean-Tigrayan border, cross-borderlands peace building we looked into before the peace agreement, because there were already local processes of reconnecting and reconciling across the Eritrean-Tigrayan border at that time, which was very fascinating to follow, kind of undermining the official stalemate policy. And what was also very fascinating to see then, after the signing of the so-called friendship agreement during the summer of 2018 between Abiy and Isaias Afwerki, when everyone expected then that the border could open up immediately, but it was held back. And the Tigrayan authorities at that time got clear instructions from Addis Ababa to stay away, so to say, from messing with local level reconciliation across the border. That was up to the capitals, Asmara and Addis, to handle. So local initiatives already from day one was blocked to give priority to the official bilateral relations. And I think that it gave at least a clear indication from the Tigrayan perspective that this peace agreement was not really a peace agreement. It was something else embedded in it. That was from the local community side. Obviously, from TPLF, from the very start, they looked upon this with a great deal of skepticism because basically they were not looped in to the negotiations. As the key region bordering Eritrea and where the former war was fought on Tigrayan soil, they felt an ownership also to a possible peace process, or at least to be included in a possible peace process. When they were excluded deliberately, they looked upon that this is something else than peace. This might be a political alliance to attack us. And I think that was maybe not the intention by Abiy Ahmed of signing the agreement, but it certainly, in my belief, was the intention of Isaias Afwerki to enter into peace with the new power holders, the Oromo power holders in Addis, in order to further marginalize and to literally kill off TPLF, which have been Isaias Afwerki's intention from day one. When Abiy saw during the summer of 2018 that he needed help to consolidate his, at that time, still fragile power, and he needed help to marginalize the Tigrayans from the official positions in the federal bureaucracy and hierarchy, he utilized Isaias and Eritrea as a leverage to do that. And it gradually evolved also in the mindset of Abiy Ahmed as not a peace agreement, but also more a political alignment against Tigray and Tigrayan interests.
So Abiy was well aware of it. It wasn't. So it wasn't only Isaias Afwerki's plan and ploy. So, but some people say that Abiy was not aware of the ploy, the trap. But as you said, lately Abiy was.
Originally, I think actually Abiy intended good. I give him the benefit of the doubt still.
Okay.
But he very quickly adapted to the rhetoric or the interest of Eritrea, of Isaias Afwerki. And he saw that that might also consolidate his own power. So it evolved gradually into a war pact, as seen from Abiy Ahmed's side. And certainly in 2019, late 2019, early 2020, it was more or less destined to go to war. And I wrote about that. I was trying to mobilize for war preventive diplomacy, for instance, which was sadly not picked up by the internationals, because it was quite clear then that both sides, all sides, Eritrea, Addis, Amhara, and Tigray, prepared for the war to come.
That's very interesting to observe, because unless we see the evolving nature of the preparation for war, we cannot just simply press a button and say that this was the turning point in the run-up for the civil war in 2020, because there are a lot of issues from political point of view, even the dismantling of the EPRDF coalition itself and the formation of the PP, Prosperity Party, which effectively alienated the TPLF, was actually one of the major factors, if we speak of structural issues, and the witch hunting justice system, where only the Tigrayans were blamed for everything. I mean, the TPLF, not Tigrayans, the TPLF leaders, so much and so much. And so we can also bring in the regional and international political dynamics. And the legitimacy that Abiy also got through the Nobel Peace Prize, by the way, it is a soft power. It is huge. It has a huge impact. So
certainly.
Yeah.
It gave him legitimacy internationally. It gave him justification to pursue the policy which were in the making already at that time when he received the Peace Prize in 2019. And I know I've been speaking to many international diplomats and envoys saying that the Nobel Peace Prize deflected, shielded him from criticism. We were very hesitant to openly criticize the sitting Nobel laureate in 2019, 2020. So it definitely served his purpose of war and not the purpose of peace.
Yeah, exactly. Because it doesn't make sense actually to give a peace award on the left hand and then criticizing with the right hand at the same time, at least. So it shielded him. It effectively served as a shield against foreign criticism, at least for the time being. That's my observation too. And so that said, once the war broke out, and in the midst of all those madness, I would say, and when around the 2020, the summer of 2021, from both sides of the spectrum, we could observe that they wanted to make it a war, it is an existential public war, all-out war. That was very frustrating. And I remember you yourself went to Ethiopia, I think. Went to Ethiopia, and they somehow opened some kind of an international coordinated smear campaign against you. And finally, you were, I think you were expelled, or they didn't allow you to stay in Ethiopia. How was the experience, and how is it now?
Well, I was invited. I was in Ethiopia 10 times in 2019. I was in Ethiopia, I think, 8 times in 2020. The last time was in September 2020, because I was invited by both the regional government of Tigray to be present during their election. And I was invited, I am an adjunct professor at Mekelle University, and they wanted me to be part of research into the process of the regional elections in Tigray, which they organized in defiance of the federal dictate, as we know, because the federal elections were postponed, arguably due to the COVID pandemic. So, but I entered Ethiopia on a formal government visa. I had all my credentials in order, all my permits from the regional authorities, and so on and so forth. But obviously, being present in Tigray during that very precarious period provoked a lot of what can I call them? Ethiopian nationalists, chauvinists, and so on. Claiming then that only my presence as an independent researcher jeopardized, I don't know what, Ethiopian stability, as they were trying to construe an argument around. Yes, and they claimed that I was there illegally on a false visa and so on and so forth. So that's the reason why I was briefly detained at Bole Airport on my return from Tigray.
When was it? When was it exactly?
Mid-September 2020, just a week or so after the regional election, or end of September. They picked me up because of the argument, which was generally peddled by ESAT in Washington, and their hate campaign against me and others who criticized the build-up of confrontation in Ethiopia. But the head of NIS at Bole and the head of immigration at Bole, after interrogating me and discussing with me for some few hours, and I showed them all my credentials, they said, okay, we don't have any formalities on you. We don't have any formal reason to keep you. I was not persona non grata. I was not expelled. I was kindly advised to leave Addis Ababa based on my own security. As I said, they couldn't protect me. They couldn't protect my security. Fair enough. I was in Ethiopia upon invitation by the government. When they say that they couldn't protect me, I left. So I think it just reflected the very much heated sentiment which was existing at that time, and how social media activism, how Ethiopian diaspora, particularly in the US, aligning with Eritrean net trolls, managed to fabricate this story and to kind of jeopardize my work and the situation in the country as such.
Yeah, I mean, it is always good to clarify, because now in retrospect we can see there are a bit of change, not a lot of change.
Well, it has been a change, exactly. And let me add that some of the most ardent critics of my research and of my principal stand on criticizing war crimes, atrocity crimes taking place in Tigray during the war, came from Amhara activists who claimed that by criticizing war crimes, you take side in the war, which is obviously a false or a flawed conclusion. Some of them have later approached me this year after the war in Amhara started and the Fano rebellion started. And when we see the civilian casualties in Amhara regional state today, which also amounts to war crimes, they have actually apologized and said that, you were correct in taking that stand, and we feel a bit ashamed of criticizing you when the same policies are now affecting our people. And I think that's a dilemma of Ethiopians, of the Ethiopian political context in itself, that the societal empathy, the pan-Ethiopian societal solidarity has withered. And that's deeply tragic, that you don't feel empathy with your neighbors who are killed and suffered because they have a different ethnicity. And I think that is one of the saddest thing I can observe in Ethiopia today, that really civilians, if they are Tigrayans, Amharas, Oromos, Afars, no matter, Somalis, civilians should stand together against atrocities coming from power, whichever power there is, and to stand up against human rights abuse and war crimes and atrocity crimes.
Yeah, I agree with you. Actually, one of the scars of war, even after the war is over, especially when it is a civil war based on identity issues, ethnic civil war, is that more than anything else, the civil war in Tigray or in the northern part of Ethiopia actually dismantled the social fabric, as you said. Many people are concerned, I myself included, that it is very, very hard to repair the social fabric which has been deteriorated or torn apart by the civil war. Because now we see it was in Tigray, and then before that it was in Oromia, now in Amhara. The same thing was happening, but people were not showing solidarity or fraternity. And without solidarity, as you know, as a scientist, that there won't be a viable political community. For a political community, there must be some sense of mutual solidarity and fraternity, and that is very concerning, to be honest, for especially for the social scientists to deal with. Are you going to heal the wound? For me, not anytime soon. But I don't know. Maybe if you want to add a couple of points on this in the process of reconstruction and reconciliation, what would be your suggestion?
I think that's a very, very pertinent question in Ethiopia today. How is it possible to reconcile local communities and across ethnic boundaries? How is it possible to build together again that social fabric which have been torn apart, as you say, by multiple wars? How is it possible to come together in solidarity? Also now facing the very, very dramatic famine and hunger which is building up in Tigray, in parts of Amhara and other parts of Ethiopia. I don't have any clear answer to that. What I do see is that the so-called government reconciliation initiative, I think is a no-starter, more or less. I think that has been politicized from day one, and it's hard to see how that process can produce genuine reconciliation. I'm rather favoring to go back to the deep cultural traditions, customary practices of reconciliation, which we find across Ethiopia. In every nationality, in every ethnicity, you do have deep-rooted customary processes of reconciliation, and to try to build from bottom up instead of from top down when it comes to these processes. It will take time. It will take very long time, I think, more so now than before earlier wars. Exactly as you say, the war on Tigray was something new in Ethiopia, where earlier wars have not targeted civilian population to that extent as we saw in Tigray. So I think it is I think it will be challenging, but it's not impossible. But I think it needs to be a depoliticized reconciliation protest, not a reconciliation constructed by the incumbent political elites.
Yeah, I think that's interesting take, and I would say that it's time to turn to a local turn of peace building and to give agency to the local society and make use of the traditional dispute resolution and societal relationship. I think that would be one way, but as you said, it is not easy. It is easier said than being done. So let's go to Pretoria Peace Agreement. Now, in my own expression, the guns are silent somewhere, which means in Tigray, but we do not see peace anywhere, okay, in Ethiopia. That is how I could put it. So then the guns are silent. So I would like to give a credit to that. That's one of the major achievements of the Pretoria Agreement, or the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement, which is 1 year old now. So what do you make of the Pretoria Agreement? I do not call it peace agreement because it is not a peace agreement. And what is missing, and how can we build on the experience of Pretoria to also resolve the conflicts which are going on in some other parts of Ethiopia, such as the one in Oromia and in Amhara as well?
Yeah, no, I agree. It's not a peace agreement, and in informality, it's also called a cessation of hostilities agreement. Its main fruit is exactly that. It has kept the guns silent between federal forces and the Tigrayan defense forces, which is great. They were the two main adversaries in the war, and they are not fighting each other now. But it is still not peace in Tigray. Eritrean troops are still occupying parts of sovereign Ethiopian territories in Tigray. Eritrean troops are still harassing Tigrayan civilians, raping Tigrayan women, and abducting Tigrayan men. You have conflict in Amhara region, you have conflict in Oromia region, you have conflict in other parts of Ethiopia. So it is not an all-inclusive, all-embracing peace, not at all. It's a very, very fragile situation. And the Pretoria Agreement, more than a cessation of hostilities agreement, it is actually a political alignment we do see. And it's kind of paradox, but it again falls into the century-old pattern of recasting alliances in the Ethiopian political context. Where
actually, sorry to interrupt, you raised very, very fundamental issue. Do you see a shifting of alliances, which is prompted by the Pretoria Peace Agreement or post-Pretoria Peace Agreement?
Certainly. We can go back to the Asmara-Addis Peace Agreement, Friendship Agreement, which was a political alignment. The Pretoria Agreement broke that political alignment effectively from day one. Suddenly, Isaias Afwerki was not the key partner to Abiy Ahmed and the federal government. TPLF was. Because Isaias Afwerki detests Tigray and TPLF, he saw that as a betrayal to his agreement with Addis. So by signing the Pretoria Agreement, Abiy Ahmed effectively dissolved the Eritrea-Ethiopia Peace Agreement. Because Isaias is still at war with Tigray. Isaias is still at war with TPLF. And you saw that immediately, or actually before even, or around the same time, Eritrea started to court and to warm up to the Amhara political elites, bypassing Addis Ababa. That happened, before the effective signing of the agreement. But after the signing of the Pretoria Agreement, we hear more and more indications that Eritrea is effectively also supporting the Fano rebellion in Amhara as part of that reconfiguration of alliances. So in Ethiopia today, paradoxically, the prosperity parties and Abiy Ahmed's only ally is TPLF. It's former enemy. And that binds both sides, both TPLF, Tigray interim government, and the federal government into some kind of very fragile, very hesitant, very reluctant alliance. We see that from both sides. We see that the federal government is still not allowing an unimpeded humanitarian access and ramping up humanitarian aid to Tigray. They are still dying of starvation in Tigray every day. And at the same time, you see the fractionizing, the power struggle within Tigrayan elites, both between the interim government and TPLF, but also within TPLF itself, as a reflection of this new alliance with the center. And I think the Pretoria Agreement will possibly also soon become a war alliance if a war breaks out with Eritrea, certainly so. But it might also become a war alliance internally in Ethiopia to consolidate the center. And that's why it is interesting to see, for instance, with the OLA, the Oromo Liberation Army negotiations, also with the federal government now recently in Tanzania, the second round. You can look upon that. I don't look upon that as a peace agreement, as a peace process. That again is a political alignment process, and possibly a preparation if that agreement comes to fruit. It will signal clearly a more joint front against Amhara rebellion, because then the center has consolidated the Oromo bloc and the Tigrayan bloc, and between them, what is there? Amhara regional state. It might also indicate a step forward, so to say, to confrontation with Eritrea, because Ethiopia needs to consolidate its own backyard before it can go to a possible war on Eritrea. So it is much better to look upon the so-called peace processes in Ethiopia as political realignment processes for new conflicts. That's what is actually happening. As you say, peace is not coming after a peace process, after a peace agreement. It's just a new cycle of war with other enemies.
That's excellent again. But then, so if we can say that the Pretoria Agreement was actually just laying the ground for another round of alignment and realignment, political realignment. Was there a possibility of averting this from happening, for example, by having an inclusive peace agreement by incorporating all pertinent stakeholders, so to speak?
Yeah.
For example, having some not necessarily in the same agreement, but having the Amhara and the Eritrean forces through the so-called multi-stakeholder diplomacy, or maybe parallel diplomacy, because we see in the Horn of Africa generally, my Professor Kornprof usually says that what is, you would definitely agree with that, I hope, that in the Horn of Africa, especially in Eritrea and Ethiopia, the most important feature of political dynamics is regime security at any cost. They are not interested even in state security, much less human security, but regime security. So it is a PP's security by forming some alliance with whomever would provide that security, temporary security. So if that is the case, and having this as a background, would it be possible to avert this situation from coming into fruition in Pretoria or even before Pretoria, in retrospect?
Yeah, not only in retrospect, I think theoretically this might be possible. And I personally submitted a position paper to one of the international facilitators of one of the processes, exactly arguing what you say, that this was during the war when I was asked for advice on how to address a possible peace process with Tigray. I said, you cannot have a process only including the federal government and Tigrayan authorities or Tigrayan defense forces. You need to include Amhara and possibly certainly Amhara, and you need to consolidate or loop in the Oromo insurgency at the same time, because OLA was a partner, a military partner with TDF at that round. And ideally, Eritrea should also be part of a peace process. But at that time, I also saw it was impossible to have Eritrea on board and to agree upon a peace. So then it is better to consolidate the Ethiopian key actors, which are the Tigray, Amhara, Oromo dynamics, to have them included in a joint process addressing both the particularities of the conflict in Oromia, of the conflict in Amhara, and the conflict in Tigray, but also addressing the commonalities, because there are so much commonalities which ground these conflicts, which are drivers to this conflict. And you need to have that all-inclusive process to settle a more durable peace in Ethiopia. If you take one by one, well, the two others will align to destroy the first process. And that's what's happening now. You see that dynamic. It will never be settled because they are all spoilers in the same context. Because again, the lack of trust, or the lack of the history of violence, the lack of institutionalization, the lack of democratic culture, and so on and so forth, are all contributing to a continued distrust and a continued hostility, so to say, as the tradition has been in Ethiopian context, sadly, that force and violence have been an accepted means to solve political issues, and still are an accepted means to solve political issues. And you have to go beyond that. And to go beyond that, you need to have the key actors around the same table. Otherwise, there will be spoilers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, as they say, exclude the spoilers if you can, include them if you must. I think we agree on this second part. We must. So if you have very key actors who are going at least going to derail the peace process, then I don't see any reasonable ground to not take that into consideration. I wasn't aware of your position paper. That is excellent. And
it's a confidential paper. So
yeah.
No wonder you want to.
Yeah, I myself wrote an article, very short, 12-page article last year, exactly in December, saying that a flawed peace process is a postponed war. That was the title of my article. So I also have a similar observation.
Yeah.
And so this brings us to Eritrea as well.
Yeah. And that's
you can reflect on that. Yeah.
Just to pick up on your kind of pun with exclude the spoilers you can, Eritrea needs to be excluded. Eritrea, the only strategy to handle the destructiveness of Isaias Afwerki is a containment strategy. If you don't want to go in to topple him, and I hope really Ethiopia won't do that, because that is just going to be another cycle of a bloody war, destroying the Eritrean society and parts of Ethiopia. So the only possible way to neutralize, the best possible way is a very comprehensive containment strategy, which TPLF successfully managed to implement after 2000 until 2015, 2016, when they started to wither. When the influence of Isaias were more or less nothing in the Horn. Now suddenly Isaias Afwerki is the relevant character, is the relevant player. Ethiopia, Sudan, across the Red Sea, and so on. And in his footpath, it only follows destructions and wars. We know that. We know that for 3 decades of empirical evidence to back that argument.
Yeah. So that actually brings us to the Ethio-Eritrean relationship. Now, it wasn't even from the very beginning, as we discussed during the honeymoon season of summer of 2018. We have that peace pact, which turned out to be a war pact, actually. So from there, we had a common enemy where Ethiopia and Eritrea fought together. And again, it seems that the relationship is strained, to put it mildly. So how do you see the current, you already partially touched upon it, the Ethio-Eritrean relationship, diplomatic relationship, especially in view of the rhetoric of access to the Red Sea and port by the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, and the fiasco that followed. Even the international community have somehow cautioned
Yeah.
So, as a keen observer of the Ethiopian and Eritrean relationship, as well as the Greater Horn of Africa, how do you see this relationship is heading to? Do you see a war rhetoric or another round of violence unfolding in front of our eyes, or maybe a different path ahead of us? How do you see it?
Well, I'm very much afraid. I'm very much pessimistic. I can say that about the development. It's not a surprise what has happened. Again, this has clear trajectories going back to 2018, 2019 already, before the war on Tigray, when Ethiopia and Ethiopian governments was keenly trying to institutionalize properly the peace agreement with Asmara through bilateral agreements of trade, port access, and cross-border movement. They wanted bilateral agreements to bind the two countries together in a transparent and accountable manner. Isaias Afwerki was not interested. He didn't want to give input into that, and he didn't want to ratify those bilateral agreements when the Ethiopian government submitted them to Asmara. And that was in the spring of 2019. And a key concern, obviously, for Ethiopia for decades, but also really picked up by Abiy Ahmed, was the access to sea port agreements from very early on. And when he saw that Isaias had no interest,
was it part of the agreement itself?
No, this was followed up and negotiated after the friendship agreement, and after the Jeddah agreement, into bilateral agreements on the macro trade, port access, and cross-border operations. I interviewed several of the Ethiopian ministers at that time because I was following up on trying to, how to relink Eritrea and Ethiopia to the benefit of both countries, to the benefit of both people. And I was told, got information on this. So, and it is natural, obviously, that Ethiopia, any Ethiopian government would like to secure predictable long-term access to sea agreements. And as the neighboring countries are, that is difficult, with the exception of Djibouti. But Djibouti is not enough to safeguard Ethiopian interest long-term. It's a single route. They need to diversify, not only for economic reasons, but also for security reasons. And when it is impossible, when your neighboring countries are in war or are fragile or have regimes which have no interest in making agreements with you, or at least that you cannot trust the long-term accountability of those agreements, well, Ethiopia rethinks. That is understandable, to diversify a new strategy. But the statements by Abiy Ahmed on access to sea by diplomacy or by force is a step further, in the sense of threatening to use force. He has later modified that and contextualized it. Ethiopia have come up with different kind of plausible or not so plausible justification. The people to people, we have Afars, you have Afars. Afars have an interesting right to Red Sea. So Ethiopian Afars, being part of the Afar community, have that right, and so on. And the same with the Somali. The Ethiopian Somalis have right to sea since they are Somalis. A lot of kind of, and also international law thrown into this, which indicates that there is a much broader reasoning from the Ethiopian side than only Abiy Ahmed's first statement. And you have the policy paper even underpinning this from the Ethiopian government. Are we heading to a new war? I'm kind of 50-50 on that. It is exactly because this have been the tradition to solve these kind of contested issues. Well, if they don't obey, let's do it by force. That's one thing. The increased hostilities because of the Pretoria Agreement between Eritrea and Ethiopia is a second indicator that it is a conflict in the coming. Eritreas or Isaias Afwerki's support of Ethiopian armed groups against the federal government is a third reason for a war to come, because you cannot have a neighbor deliberately destabilizing you. It can be construed as self-defense, for that matter, to stop that involvement. And a fourth or a fifth or a sixth, whatever reason for being afraid of a new war is possibly in Abiy Ahmed's own personality, that he wants to put a legacy of his rule which will last for 1,000 years. And the legacy after Abiy will be the restoration of the Ethiopian empire as it once was, meaning access to sea. Can be partly interpreted with his kind of grandiose self-presentation as he expresses it. So I think we should be worried. I definitely think we should be worried that a new war is not only possible, but maybe even plausible.
Good. Yeah. So there is a cause for concern that there would be a possibility of a war breaking out. But then, do you think the condition is the final question? Do you think even though Abiy wish to even wage a war tomorrow, or the other way around, Isaias could provoke a war? So war is always intersubjective, to use your language. So, but is the international and the regional conditions, including the national condition for Abiy, conducive? Because wanting something is another issue. One thing is then whether you have a conducive capability, whether you have a capability to wage another war is another issue. Because I think it is suicidal, given what is going on in Ethiopia now. Abiy's power is very precarious, more than it used to be, even, as you have already mentioned. So this brings us again, we can link it to the role of the regional powers, let's say the Gulf states, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and you name it. Do you see to borrow the economic term, the invisible hands, or are they even more visible now?
Yeah, I think this you have pro and contra arguments here. The contra arguments that it will not be war is, as you say, because the Ethiopian political landscape is fragmented, is divisive, that economically you are weak. Hence, you cannot either have the economic capacity nor the people's interest, so to say, to go to a war against Eritrea. But
as well as the international support as well. Yeah.
As well as international support, obviously, which is important, obviously. That is not there. But those three arguments, and all three of them, can be turned around. First of all, the economy has never stopped any Ethiopian politician not to go to war. You have been very poor, sadly enough, for decades and decades, and you have always gone to war. So economy is not the key factor here. I just have to say very bluntly. The people's support, or you can say nationalism. Well, what is creating nationalism than a war against an external enemy? It will be hypothetically very hard for the Amhara political elites, now fighting the center, receiving support from Eritrea, to stand by and be critical to a war campaign with the aim of bringing parts of Eritrea back to the motherland, which is something Amhara elites have been arguing for 30 years. So, and that kind of war might again infuse pan-Ethiopian nationalism, as we have seen earlier with the 1998-2000 war. So it might be in the head of a authoritarian thinking that if we put up a war against an external enemy, this will rally the troops, this will circle the wagons, and people will join in that. And then you have the international element. We do know that the Emirates, for instance, or particularly the UAE, is the main financial backer of the Ethiopian regime today. Both cash in foreign currency to try to assist in that regard, but also financing, for instance, of the Grand Palace development project. And what's in it for the Emirates to back on a larger, very high scale financially the Ethiopian government? What's in it for them? Well, we know that the Emirates are the key player in port management all along the African east coast and beyond. And they were thrown out of Djibouti. They wanted to go to Assab, but it also stopped there because of the change of alliances. And they want a footprint in the Red Sea, the Emirates. And what's more natural to have Assab if Ethiopia can guarantee them that? This is not my empirical evidence. I'm saying that this is thinking among certain fractions internationally. So you have the regional powers all now invested in what's going on in the Red Sea. Saudi, Emirates, and internationals. And you see that, with the last couple of weeks attacks on the sea traffic there, how that has disturbed the whole world, so to say, more or less. And an added element at an international level, which might actually work in favor of a war campaign, to use that, is that there is not a single nation, with the exception of Putin's Russia, who will come to the defense of Isaias Afwerki. Formally, they will say, oh, bad Ethiopia. You should not violate international law. You should not, attack Eritrea. But if no one will complain if Isaias Afwerki is toppled.
That point actually was my build-up argument when I'm saying the West might be interested in Isaias' go or a regime change. But
not only the West, I think beyond the West.
Yeah, even beyond the West. But there is a big but for me. On their own terms. Not when Abiy wage wars as he wishes, but on their own terms. That would be very relevant, right?
Certainly so. That would definitely be the best, that Eritreans on their own terms take care of it. But I'm saying that if an intervention happens, no one will defend a re-annexation of Eritrea. Not at all. Eritrean sovereignty is there. But if Isaias is toppled and you get a transitional government in Eritrea, which have an interest for a peaceful region and which have an interest to benefit economically by entering into agreements with Ethiopia to enhance the living conditions of Eritrean people, well, it's a win-win situation, isn't it?
Is it? It is. Yeah. So that was quite right. This brings us to the end of our show. And so finally, not to end on a very pessimist assessment of the situation in the Horn of Africa, mainly Ethiopia and the Ethio-Eritrean relationship. Do you see the prospect for peace? Any room for making a comprehensive and lasting peace in Ethiopia as well as in the region?
I was going to say not in my lifetime, but hopefully it will be within the next 20, 30 years, but not in the near future, no.
Then even to achieve something in the long term, but there should be steps to be taken, right? Even after.
Certainly, even though I'm pessimistic in regards to that, we shouldn't give up. Definitely not. We should work even harder to try to strengthen whatever peace initiatives there are particularly from the grassroots and up, as I said. The peace needs to be anchored in the local communities. The peace deals which have been entered into so far are political realignments of political elites, which are all not accountable to their people. You don't have any accountability, and that's the core issue here. You don't have political accountability in any of the countries of the Horn of Africa. So the political elites can reproduce themselves and can reproduce conflict to sustain their power indefinitely.
Well, yeah, it is very, very daunting task, even though we get into the task of somehow reinventing the wheel, which is very, very, quite impossible, hardly possible. But still, never giving up is, I think, the best way to end. So thank you very much, Professor. It has always been my privilege. I'm looking forward to hear from you. Actually, I take this as an expert lecture for our guests and our followers. I hope this would not be the end, even though it is probably the beginning. I wish you a safe and healthy Christmas for you and for your beloved ones. And I hope we'll meet maybe somehow in a different capacity and possibly on academic road. So thank you very much. And it was a pleasure having you again.
Thank you so much, Mugus. Thank you for inviting me. And please come back. And seasonal greetings to all viewers too.